Tommy, how are you?
I'm really good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, I've been looking forward to this. We have had a lot of people on to talk about longevity and brain health and human optimization. And I'm really excited to talk to you about, some intriguing angles on longevity that go beyond eat well, sleep, meditate, which are all important processes. But, right off the bat, I came across a study that you've cited that it says basically that when you retire, people that retire die early.
Uh-huh.
Can we just start there? Because this community, our community, are people that are switched on, getting after it, and considering the good life, whether it's during the work phase or post retirement. So, can we just start with that idea?
Sure. Obviously, this is a very difficult thing to study. Right? You can't randomize people to retire earlier or later and see who dies sooner. So those particular studies that look at that, obviously we just have to look at a population of people and try and understand what happens. There are a couple of studies that have done this, and they basically show that those who retire 7 to 10 years earlier, so early retirement versus normal retirement, say, those who retire earlier die sooner. And that's after you adjust for a whole host of things that might contribute to this. So maybe you retired for medical reasons, and then obviously that health condition may contribute to you dying sooner, right? So adjusting for things like that. And the signal that kind of comes out of that, and I think it really sort of brings together threads from multiple areas of both neuroscience and sort of general biology and physiology of longevity or health span, is that if, essentially the simple concept is use it or lose it. And we know that tissues in the body respond to stresses or, demands by strengthening, improving their function, improving their regenerative capacity. And if we don't use them, then they will atrophy. And muscle mass is one that people may be familiar with, right? If you don't use your muscles, they get smaller, they get weaker. They are energetically expensive. So if you don't need them, your body won't keep them around. And we could probably think about that for pretty much any tissue in the body, and including the brain. That's the one that I'm the most interested in. But I'm also very interested in muscle tissue because those things are intimately connected. And so if we're not using our brains, if we're not using our bodies, then they will start to atrophy. They won't repair as they would otherwise. And, in sort of a bigger picture, eventually that will lead to earlier loss of function and eventually death.
And when you say use your brain, it's easy to think about using your body, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about straining, we're talking about recovery, we're talking about range of motion, we're talking about stressing your system, your physical system, so that you build the right type of stimulus and repair for it to maintain this a slower decline. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
So how do you do? Because I think it was probably like a decade ago, maybe more. Yeah, it was about a decade ago, where there was a big buzz on brain training and technology to help support a sharp memory, if you will.
Yeah.
So I'm not specifically asking about that, but in general, first, how do you strain and stress and use your brain according to some best practices?
It's a great question. And I like the answer because depending on who you are and the things that you enjoy and prefer, you have lots of different options, essentially. In order to bring context to it, when I think about the stresses that are beneficial for the brain, I like to go all the way back to when you're developing your brain in the first place, which is convenient because I'm a neonatal neuroscientist. That's what I do for the majority of my day job. And think about what an infant does as their brain is developing and they are starting to learn about the world. They spend a huge amount of time learning how to coordinate very fine and gross movements of this meat sack that carries them around, right? And it's incredibly difficult to learn those processes. Similarly, the process of learning language, right? Learning to speak There's benefits we could talk about later from learning multiple languages at the same time. But just the act of learning a language, incredibly complex. Learning social interaction, again, something that's very difficult and needs time and effort and practice. Those three things sort of make up the majority of what your brain gets as inputs as it's developing. And those are the same inputs that can improve, strengthen the brain, the connections, function, essentially throughout the entire lifespan. So, like I mentioned earlier, those who are bilingual have better connections, better cognitive reserve late into life. Those who do some kind of skill-based movement, particularly movement that challenges coordination, seems to be particularly beneficial for preventing cognitive decline. So when they've done meta-analyses looking at all the studies of exercise interventions for preventing cognitive decline, dementia, those that have a balance component seem to be the most protective. And it's probably because when you're challenging your orientation in physical space, it's a much stronger stimulus to the brain to try and orient itself and protect itself. It's sort of almost like an existential threat if you're not, fully oriented in space. So coordinative and balanced movements, they have a particular benefit. And music is another one. There are multiple studies showing that musicians have younger looking brains compared to those who aren't musicians. And they also have these tighter connections throughout the brain later into life. And what's interesting is that no matter where you are on this trajectory of developing or trying to keep a brain, difficult things, as you learn them, are the important stimulus. So if you look at amateur musicians versus professional musicians, amateur musicians have more of a benefit from the music than professionals because it's harder for them to do. They're less good at it. And this could be the same for language. It could be the same for going out, making new friends, new social connections. It could be new movement strategies. It can be teaching others. That seems to provide, teachers seem to have some degree of benefit as well. So any of these things, these challenges that you might use to develop your brain as an infant are the same things that you can then adapt and apply as an adult.
Okay, so if we play it back, we're talking about language,
Yep.
music, balance, and teaching. And what's underneath the surface is making sure that you're right up against that learning edge.
Yes.
Where it's difficult to do the thing for an extended period of time. It challenges, more resources, internal resources to be able to do it. Does that sound right so far?
Yeah, exactly. It has to be challenging. Something, and everybody, or people often ask for some kind of procedure, protocol. If you're right up against some, learning barrier where you're trying to get better at a skill, 10, 15, 20 minutes of that sort of frustrated application seems to be where people should spend time. Beyond that, it probably becomes overly stressful that it's maybe not worth doing at that moment in time and then returning to it. But it's that level of difficulty where you're challenging yourself and it's almost, there's an aspect of frustration to it and maybe failure to then learn and adapt as part of it.
And where do you get the 15 to 20 minutes from? And again, I just want to not reframe, but I want to say 15 to 20 minutes of deep, you're calling it frustrating, but deep practice where you're right at the learning edge. And with that comes some frustration. But where do you get the 15 to 20? Is that, I haven't seen it or read it, but I'm super intrigued.
It's an application of, I guess, multiple areas of neuroscience where that's probably the period of time where you can apply concentrated effort to any given thing. It underlies the timing of, say, the Pomodoro technique for, applied focus. So it just seems to be a period of time that people seem to be able to commit to and get some benefit from, without, either under or overplaying it. And of course, there's some individual variation, but sort of as like an average, it seems to fall somewhere in that time period.
And can you just expand on the Pomodoro technique?
So the Pomodoro technique being one way to apply focused periods of time to get some productivity done. So there are timers that you can use this, but it's usually 20 minutes, say, of focused application and then a 5-minute break. And both are necessary. So even if at the end of 20 minutes, you're like, I feel good, I'm going to keep going. You stop, you do your defined break, and then you get back into it. And there are multiple reasons why this is potentially beneficial. Task switching in smaller periods of time seems to be more cognitively demanding, but for less overall benefit. So when you're like checking your email and then doing something else for a couple of minutes, then something else, it takes a lot of cognitive demand, but you get less overall productivity. So you feel busy, but the end output is probably more physiologically stressful and less overall productivity. So these small focused periods of time seem to result in better overall work on average.
So what are you doing for some of these? Obviously, you're in a learning mode. You're a student, of neuroscience, neonatal neuroscience to be particular. But I know you're a learner. You're a great learner. I'm imagining you're applying these. But how are you applying the balance part or the physical movement part? Or are you doing anything for language or music or anything else that you might be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I talk about these things, I then think about, well, how do I apply this myself? Because I do want to, walk the talk. So two main areas. So in the movement area, in my movement practice, I am an amateur strongman competitor. And so that involves a lot of skill-based movements. It's sort of like difficult to lift heavy loads and that kind of thing. So that's something that I practice in the gym. But outside of that, I frequently, it's right underneath my feet, I have a slack block, which is basically like a mini slackline where you can stand and balance for periods of time. And the reason why I have it under my desk is because then I don't forget to do it. It's just like right there. It's like the same thing with the chin-up bar under under the doorway. So that's somewhere where I sort of do, 5 to 15 minutes of sort of balance practice per day, sort of just as part of, if I'm on a Zoom call or a meeting, I'll do that.
Wait. You've got a wire, like a standing wire underneath your desk that you can just stand on while you're taking a meeting?
It's not a wire. It's a block with foam underneath.
Oh God. Okay.
So it gives you the same.
I was imagining a slack line.
No.
No.
It's called a slack block. So it's kind of like a pseudo slack line for just for 1 foot. Literally, this is like, what's the minimum effective thing that I can do that I know I'll improve in over time? This is it. But there are multiple different options. Anything that challenges your balance. If it's just standing on 1 foot while you're brushing your teeth, that's going to give you some stimulus. None of, if I had a proper slack line in the backyard and I spent 30 minutes of focused slack line work every day, that would probably be the best possible stimulus. But trying to fit these things in throughout the day.
Are you more interested in health span? Are you more interested in longevity? Are you more interested in brain health? Like if you started to narrow in just a little bit, what is the thing you're most interested in?
I think I would have to pick, if I had to pick one, it would be health span, which is essentially just the fundamental idea of wanting, it's like life in your years rather than years in your life. Right?
Yeah.
Live long, drop dead kind of thing. And so I have no great interest or necessarily belief that myself or humans in general can live to be 120, 150, 180 years old.
You do not?
I do not. But I have a number of family members who lived well into their 90s with good quality of life. That sounds pretty good. And so I'd like to do everything that I can in order to achieve that, if possible.
So what are you referencing that idea, that kind of first position, if you will, about lifespan, health span and lifespan here, or longevity? We're talking about longer, extending years, because there are so many quote unquote, and I'm going to have a hard time saying this out loud. There's so many biohackers that are convinced that they are going to live to be 150 because technology is better, nutrition's better, practices are better, like we know more, fill in the blanks. And what are you looking at that says, no, I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime, and I'm not sure it's going to happen in any lifetime?
So when you look at, I guess, the science that underpins these projections, right now, there is no agreement as to what the limit of human lifespan is. If you look at the age that is relatively frequently reached, but not that frequently, it's maybe 110 ish to 120 years old. That seems to be like the common limit of human lifespan as we currently stand. When you apply statistical models to these data, some people will say, oh, that's a pretty hard limit. That's probably going to be our best lot. Other people will apply different statistical models to the same data, essentially, and say, oh, there's no definite limit to human lifespan. And so while that is up in the air, I feel like it's probably not a particularly useful strategy to say, oh, yes, I'm going to live to 150 years old, because right now we have no evidence that that's even possible. It may well be possible in the future.
We recently just lost the oldest person that's ever lived, a Japanese woman that lived to be about 122 years old. I think her name was Jean. Are you familiar with her story?
I did. I'm not familiar with the story, but I remember just seeing the headline of that. Yeah.
Yeah, Jean or Jeannie. And I'm not sure. I've only read it. My question is like, okay, so 122, she's the half percenter, the fraction of a percenter that's lived that long. It would make sense though, as we get better and smarter and have better resources, that we could move that 122 to 132 to 142. It does make some sense, but that might take 200 years to do so, or 400 years to do so. Is that more of your position, that people are going to live to be older, but it's probably not going to happen in our lifetime? Or are you saying, no, I think it's going to stay at 120s in the 120s?
Oh, no, I am certain that we will slowly eke that number out as, genetics and healthcare and technology improve. So all the models that we have currently, any statistical model is only based on historical data, right? So it's impossible to project into the future. So yes, I'm sure that number will continue to slowly increase, but I think it's very unlikely that on a large population level, we are going to frequently, see the average lifespan be over 100 years old. Most of that is because of health inequities and societal issues rather than because we cannot do it. But for myself, I'm not convinced that in the next 60 years, we are going to dramatically extend human lifespan.
Okay, I want to take a quick little break here to talk about Haya. So typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise. They're filled with teaspoons of sugar, chemicals that you do not want your kids ingesting. This is why Haya was created. The pediatrician-approved superpowered chewable vitamin. Haya is made from a blend of 12 farm fresh fruits and vegetables, and then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals known to help support a healthy immune system, energy levels, brain function, mood, teeth, bones, and more, of course. It's non-GMO, vegan, dairy-free, allergy-free, gelatin-free, nut-free, and everything else that you can imagine. They've really been thoughtful about it. Haya is designed for kids of all ages and then sent right to your door. My 13-year-old son, he loves it. It's his go-to. And what I love about it is that I know that what he's consuming has been thoughtfully designed by people that think like me, like they want their best for their kids. And the way that they're designing this, your first month comes with a reusable glass bottle. So they're thinking about the environment too. And then they've even made it fun where your kids can personalize it with stickers. So my son's got his initials on his. And then every month thereafter, Haya sends a no plastic refill pouch with fresh vitamins. To grab this deal, go to hayahealth.com/finding mastery or enter the code Finding Mastery at checkout. So it's Haya Health, spelled Hiya, Haya Health. hayahealth.com/Finding Mastery to get your kids full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. Full discount is applied at checkout. And Finding Mastery is also brought to you by Masterclass. With Masterclass, you can learn from the world's best minds anytime, anywhere, at your own pace. With over 100 classes from a range of world-class instructors, that thing that you've always wanted to do is closer than you think. I've loved my experience taking countless classes over the past few years, and one of the recent classes I've enjoyed was with Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks. Working up in Seattle, I got to know him. And this masterclass, captures his brilliance on how he's taken a vision, which was grounded in relationships and coffee, to be able to scale that vision across the world. It's remarkable. Another thing I love about Masterclass is how easily it is to access their classes, whether it be on your computer, phone, or TV, they've got you covered. With this new audio mode, you can even listen in your car while traveling. So I'm highly recommending that you check out what Masterclass has to offer. Get unlimited access to every Masterclass, and as a Finding Mastery listener, you get 15% off your annual membership. So go to masterclass.com/findingmastery. Again, that's masterclass.com/findingmastery for 15% off your Masterclass. And with that, let's get right back into our conversation. Are you familiar with the different regions or countries in the world and their lifespans?
Yeah.
Have you seen that? Yeah. So you and I are both in the United States at this point. I don't think you were born here, though, were you? Not with that accent.
Actually, I was, despite the accent. I was born in Evanston, Illinois.
And then how long did you spend in Europe?
I was there from when I was 5 until I was 30.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So all that being said is the United States, we are not in the top 10% of healthspan, lifespan countries. So like, I think we're 85 out of 200 and something. It's like just barely kind of middle of the pack. And it's probably due to the stress, quote unquote, I know that's a placeholder for a lot of words, but it's probably due to high stress. And you can imagine the ones that, for most countries where people don't live as long, because like Somalia maybe, or some really high stress environments. But can you just talk maybe a little bit about two parts? What do you think we're using this as a springboard to the environmental conditions that promote a good life? And then the second is I want to double click underneath and talk about what is actually happening to our body from both a brain and a body perspective as we get older. What does the degradation look like? So let's just start with the environmental conditions first.
A lot of people will have heard of the blue zones, I'm sure. So regions in Greece, Sardinia, Okinawa in Japan, a small part of the coast of Costa Rica, Seventh-day Adventists in California. Groups where they have the highest proportion of centenarians and supercentenarians, so people who live to be 100 or 110 years old. Actually, following right behind that are places like Hong Kong, Iceland, which is where half of my family are from, which are pretty close. They don't have that sort of blue zone moniker, but in terms of overall average lifespan, they're pretty close, into the high 80s, or mid to high 80s. And so people have sort of fetishized the blue zones a little bit, and really focused in particularly on diet. Everybody wants to talk about diet. But so dietary components, certainly useful, nutritious, whole foods, local, seasonal, all that kind of stuff. And I think that applies in the majority of regions of the world. But in Iceland, that's fish, not many starchy carbohydrates, whatever, deer, meat, other things. Obviously, they have a very animal rich diet. Similarly in Hong Kong, actually. And so that's one aspect. I think sort of overall nutrient density, food quality plays a big role. Then there's a huge, huge social component. So, all of the areas of the blue zones, they have meals together. They have some kind of meditative or religious or community practice where, they spend time in the moment, either together or alone or both. And then that seems to be consistent across a lot of communities that have longevity. Then, this opportunity for rest and relaxation, so a strong circadian rhythm, being able to actually sleep properly, rest and recover properly, a frequent movement practice, and that being part of the environment. Again, that's common across all those regions. And so that probably encompasses most of it. So being able to have some kind of I guess another thing that's important is, be it meaning or purpose, you have some function in society, and that can be your job, or it could be something else. And then that continues for your entire life, right? In a lot of those communities, whatever it is, your function, maybe it changes, but you always have one. You're not just like parked in a nursing home and left there. So you're always a part of the community and you have some meaning or purpose through your work or otherwise. And then the opportunity to rest and recover, interact socially, move frequently. And any environment that fosters those things, I think, provides the environment for a long and healthy human life.
Now, let's just swing over to the brain really quickly, which is, I know, straight down your lane here. So what happens to the declining brain? What are we most concerned about?
When you think about cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, like most people like focus really hard in on the pathology, the development of aggregated pathological proteins in the brain. You might have heard of amyloid beta. Now people are focusing more on tau. And this does happen.
Hold on.
Right?
Will you explain both of those? Those are really important. Yeah, those are good.
Yeah, absolutely. So amyloid comes from a amyloid precursor protein. And as with many proteins in the body, it can be chopped up in different ways. And when essentially the brain is stressed, that's kind of my go-to term, some kind of neurological stress. And it could be inflammatory, it could be toxic, like a heavy metal exposure. It could be an infection. It could be persistently high blood glucose levels. These things, this protein can accumulate. And on the other side, you can normally clear it to a certain extent, and sleep is really critical for that. And so you wanted to put on the glucose thread more.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay. So now I don't really want to get too much into amyloid for one very specific reason, which is that the amount of amyloid in your brain doesn't correlate to your symptoms or your decline. We know they're associated, but really poorly. And that's the same in animal models as well as in humans. However, it's kind of an epiphenomenon of neuronal stress in my mind. It's something that happens alongside as neurons are stressed over time.
Okay.
And we do know that once you get enough, then the aggregation or buildup of amyloid can become damaging in its own right. So eventually you get to this feed-forward cycle, but that's not where most people end up. As part of this kind of buildup of proteins in the brain over time, you also see hyperphosphorylated tau, which is another protein that builds up inside the neurons themselves. And essentially, it can get to a point where the protein sort of clumps together and can actually like damage the cell itself because it's built up so much inside. And that's sort of like the next thing that we're looking at in Alzheimer's disease. And these things sort of happen on a cascade. We think, sort of like happen over time. One triggers the next. However, like I said, I'm not entirely convinced that this is the focus that we should take. And it comes back to, I guess, some of the things that we talked about earlier. So we know that some of these activities are protective and maybe protective even in the context of having all those proteins build up, right? Because those things aren't directly correlated. And we also, if we look at animal models, and this is where I'm going, if you want to create cognitive decline, there are essentially three ways to do it. One is to decrease supply of necessary nutrients to the brain. You can slow flow from the carotid arteries, less blood, less oxygen is getting to the brain. So you decrease supply. You can also damage the actual process of producing energy. So one thing you see in Alzheimer's disease is a decrease in cytochrome C oxidase, which is one of the key proteins in the electron transport chain in mitochondria. And you can actually recreate this with a very small dose of cyanide, which essentially attacks that process. So you can create this sort of phenotype of cognitive decline by gently poisoning your mitochondria just a little bit. And there are multiple things that could potentially do this. And we see this process happening again in infections, inflammation, maybe in response to hyperglycemia, some of these other things. So that's another one. You can decrease supply. You can decrease just like the metabolic process, or you can decrease demand on the other side. You just ask for less of the brain and it will produce less. And there are ways that we can do that in animal models, and we like humans, animals benefit from enrichment in the environment, interaction with things, cognitive stimulation. And that can be other animals. It could be toys and things to play with. And in any model of injury, providing environmental stimulation, environmental enrichment, be that with other animals or with, toys, interaction in the environment, it's neuroprotective. The brain will recover better. Equally, if you remove those things from the environment, the brain will decline faster. So this goes back to our retiring early. We've removed the stimulus. So for the declining brain, or to prevent the brain from declining, the three things we know we need are good vascular supply of stuff to get up to the brain. So you don't want your carotid arteries or, cerebral arteries to become, atherosclerosed, sort of clogged, for want of a better word. We want to maintain good mitochondrial function. And so that's providing adequate nutrients, also maybe avoiding certain toxins. So there's interest in pollutants in the water, air pollution, other things that may contribute to this.
Heavy metals,
exactly. And then on the other side, you need to maintain demand. So those three things, I think, and for different people, different combinations of those will be important. But that's kind of the framework that I would use in the context of a brain that you want to keep functioning for as long as possible.
So on the supply side, we're talking about nutrition. We're talking about exercise on the supply side. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe it's not so complicated to think about. We're increasing oxygenation across the system, the ecosystem, so that our brain is being fed properly, right? From good nutrients, but good oxygen as well. So we need our heart to be strong. We need to stress the system in a more challenging way, call it acute stress rather than a chronic stress, to be able to have that supply. Okay. And we should probably, before I go on the other two quickly, let's go back to the blood sugar levels. Let's talk about that for a minute, because I think we're confused about, I don't think anyone's really confused about what good nutrition is. Apple and an apple pie. We know the apple is the right choice for the most part. We have to work pretty hard to say the apple pie is the right choice. But so most people know what good nutrition, healthful nutrition is. But I don't think most people really understand the damage that takes place when our glucose system is out of whack. So can you speak to that specifically from a brain perspective?
There are multiple ways that you can attack this. We could go into like deep mechanism. But one of the most compelling things for me in this arena, first, if you think about Alzheimer's disease, one thing that's pathognomonic, it is like a hallmark of the disease, is that if you inject a glucose tracer, less will be taken up into the brain. The brain is less metabolically active from a glucose utilization perspective.
I don't understand.
I'm
lost here. Yeah.
So you can do something called a PET scan.
Yep.
Which basically it's a measure of different. You can, depending on the process you're testing, you give some kind of molecule that you're interested in the process of, and you tag it, usually with some kind of radioactive tag, and then you can see where it goes in the body. We use it to look at different types of cancer. We can use it to look at the activity of the brain in Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, great.
And one thing you see is less uptake of glucose into the brain in somebody with age-related cognitive decline, specifically in areas that seem to be affected. And it's thought that there's been some kind of generation of insulin resistance in the brain, where basically the brain is no longer listening to the signal of the insulin signaling of glucose. Glucose isn't getting to the brain. The brain's kind of turned down that signal. One of the potential reasons for that, and there are multiple, is a continuous oversupply of signal. Right? We know of everything that happens in the body, there's some kind of feedback loop. So if you have some kind of glucose signal, and it's consistently high, so your glucose is always high, you might turn down the volume a little bit to try and protect your cells. And that's essentially what the process of insulin resistance is. Those cells are trying to protect themselves from that signal. So that seems to be part of this process. And when you look at brains of, so this study was done in people with diabetes, but when you look in brains of people with diabetes, those who have the highest fasting blood sugar level have the oldest looking brains. And there's this nice algorithm called the brain age algorithm, easy to remember. It's basically an MRI scan that uses a machine learning model to guess essentially how old your brain is. So people may have heard of various measures of biological age, chronological age. This is the same thing, but using a brain scan. And within those who were in this one study, they applied this to those with diabetes. And one of the strongest signals was the difference between those who had lower and higher blood sugar on how much older the brain looked. So there are multiple reasons why persistently high blood sugar may cause problems, but you can also you can see it. And we know that the faster your brain ages, the worse your decline in cognitive function. Wasn't the same study, but a different study using the same procedures.
So some people genetically have a challenge with what we're talking about. Most people have earned this problem. They've eaten themselves or sat themselves into this problem. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I would even say when it comes to genetics of, say, type 2 diabetes, because that's kind of, if you're thinking about, or metabolic syndrome, which is sort of one of the later stages of insulin resistance or, persistent high blood sugar, those two, and they often come together. Even those at genetic risk requires an environmental setting that promotes that. If you go to the Bolivian Tsimane, which is a hunter-gatherer tribe that's been studied for multiple different regions because it's still relatively close to its original sort of hunter-gatherer type lifestyle. They have a genetic predisposition to diabetes were they to be put in the modern American environment, but they have a 0% prevalence of diabetes in their home environment. And so people like to talk about genetic risk, but I'm a big fan of saying there are modifiable things that are probably more important for the vast majority of people.
Okay, I want to take a quick break here to talk about Sundays. If you're like me, your dog is part of your family. I love my dog. So why are you feeding them this burnt store-bought kibble? I feed Morris, my dog. I feed him Sundays, and he loves it. Doesn't even realize that it's designed to be a healthy choice. Sundays is the first and only human-grade air-dried dog food. So they combine the nutrition and the taste of all natural human-grade foods with the ease of a zero-prep, ready-to-eat formula. Sundays is the best way to feed your best friend. Unlike most human-grade dog foods, Sundays is gently air-dried and ready to eat, versus other brands that are cooked and frozen instead. There's no fridge, there's no prep, no cleanup. It's as simple as a scoop, serve, and watch your pup devour it. And there's no artificial binders, synthetic additives, or general garbage. Seriously, look at the label. I want to encourage you to do that. And then simply said, Sunday makes it easier for me to be a great dog parent. We've worked out a special deal for you here. Receive 35% off your first order. So go to sundaysfordogs.com/finding mastery or use the code finding mastery at checkout. That's Sundays for dogs. So that's spelled SUNDAYS, Sundays for FOR dogs, DOGS. Sundaysfordogs.com/finding mastery. Switch to Sundays and feel great about what you're feeding your dog. And Finding Mastery is also brought to you by Athletic Greens. So I started using Athletic Greens because, quite simply, I want to be great with my nutrition. And I do struggle making and ordering the right variety of foods to get in the required variety of nutrients. So I've been using AG for 6+ years. And I don't know what to tell you, but I'm stoked on it. I love the energy levels I have on a daily basis. And AG is a part of that equation. It's just one scoop in the morning. That's what I do. And in that, I'm absorbing 75 high quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, adaptogens, all to help, get the day started right. So the special blend of ingredients that they've created are designed to support gut health, nervous system, immune system, energy, recovery, focus, aging, all of those things. And right now, health matters. It's front and center. And so I want to encourage you to invest in your immune system in lots of ways, and Athletic Greens is one of those ways. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you 1 free year supply of immune supporting vitamin D, and they're also throwing in 5 free individual packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/finding mastery. Again, that is athleticgreens.com/finding mastery to take ownership of your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. And with that, let's jump right back into the conversation. My grandmother-in-law, my wife's grandmother, she's 96. She eats more sugar than anyone I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. She's as strong as an ox. Like, she's on it, And so it's like, wow. And she's sneaking sugar from her kids, like they can't believe it. Like, they're trying to do their very best, but for whatever reason, and she's always had a sugar tooth, her brain is craving sugar, and she is not on the decline. Certainly there's compromises at 96 from a cognitive functioning standpoint, but can you just speak to that for a moment? Because okay, for the 30-year-old or the 40 or 50-year-old listening here, 60, 70 even. Yeah, the main message here is like, get your glucose in order, right? From a cholesterol standpoint, from a heart standpoint, from a brain performance standpoint, from an overall, quality of life standpoint, get your glucose in order. Put down the sugar. But I'm not so sure that's right for her. So can you talk to, because I do understand that, and this is straight down your lane, folks that have had concussions crave sugar. So I think that there's something here that I can't quite stitch together, and I'm hoping you can.
Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, because it's interesting, unfortunately for those who would like a defined answer, one thing that we've learned, or the main thing that we've learned about blood sugar in the last 5 years, is that it is impossible to predict so far how one individual will respond to a certain diet or food. Maybe the original studies, or so that sort of really brought this forward, were done by at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, where they took nearly 1,000 individuals. They put continuous blood glucose monitors on them, so like measuring their glucose all the time, 24 hours a day, and they fed them a whole bunch of foods. And you take 2 individuals, and they have these nice graphs in their papers. So you take 2 individuals, one gets a banana, one gets a cookie, or they both get banana, they both get a cookie. In one individual, the cookie, no change in blood sugar. Looks great. But the banana causes this big blood sugar spike. In the other, the exact opposite thing happens. So the first thing to point out at this point is that if you want to know how somebody will respond to a given food, you have to test them. And there are, so those guys, they started a company called Day 2, where they can try and predict which foods you will respond to based on a stool test. Maybe we'll end up there. There's Tim Spector in London and his Zoe group are doing something similar. They've done similar studies, and they've said, if you're trying to predict how somebody will respond to a given meal in terms of a blood sugar response, things that matter include obviously the meal itself, genetics, the timing of the food, which meal of the day it is, how do they sleep, have they exercised recently, all this, what's their general health, what's their normal blood sugar regulation if you measured their HbA1c or other things. So all of these things play into that. And so to say, this person is eating a lot of sugar, but they seem to be great, for them, it may not be causing any issues in terms of, say, from a pure blood sugar regulation standpoint. It's perfectly possible. So that's the first answer to your question, is that any given individual, I can't tell you do or don't eat this food because it's bad for your blood sugar, because honestly, I have no idea.
So let me pause you right there before you get to the payoff on this. I love this. By the way, all the measures, the markers that you've been describing, I've done most of them. And I would encourage everybody to have some understanding of glucose monitoring, have some understanding of some of your insulin profile, so your glucose profile. So you can understand, like, how does your body metabolize and work with choices that you're making. So, and they're not that complicated. Like, I think Boston Heart has a really good panel. I'm not sure which panels that are commercial grade that you're using, but Boston Heart was one that I used. It was awesome. And so, and listen, I'm speaking now right to the audience. Anyone that would like some recommendations or referrals, let me know. I'm happy to share those resources with you. We can put them in the show notes and whatever. But do you have any go-tos that you have found to be useful?
In terms of panels or
Panels
like
first.
individual
Yeah.
tests.
Yep.
So I've used a wide range. At one point, I had a lot of people doing True Health Diagnostics. Well, that still existed. It doesn't now. Boston Heart is obviously very popular. Most of the tests that I would generally recommend, you can get from Quest or LabCorp. You might be able to get them through your healthcare provider and get them reimbursed through insurance, because if you're talking about basic blood sugar tests, maybe a fasting insulin, HbA1c, all of these things you can get pretty much anywhere, or they're even super cheap direct to consumer. So I mean, if you really want to delve deep into your different into an advanced lipid test, then yes, you could do like some of the Boston Heart things, but for an overall quick look, usually the basics will do a good job.
Okay, let's go back to your payoff here of the story.
I think there is obviously some neurological basis to craving or desire for foods, right? And some of it is going to be energy supply. The majority, I think, of cravings that we have for food in general are more socially or environmentally driven, right? It's not that you're at a point where your brain is so desperate for nutrients that it's driving your craving for sugar, because the majority of us are privileged enough to not have to deal with that. In the setting of something like an acute brain injury, obviously there is going to be some kind of increased energy demand, particularly in the recovery phase. Depending on the type of injury, there's usually some kind of sort of change of a time in terms of what is demanded, versus what's like increased energy demand, say for repair, versus ability to produce energy. So in some of the brain injuries that I study, particularly like these acute, significant vascular type brain injuries, so it could be a stroke or a cardiac arrest or something like that, there's this dip in mitochondrial function early on in the injury that potentially recovers later on. So there's a continuous, again, changing supply and demand. But as you recover, you will have increased energy requirements in order to institute some kind of repair. So that could drive certain cravings. In particular, concussion, well, actually any acute brain injury, we can see again from animal models, as well as much as possible from the human data, if you have persistently or swinging high blood sugar levels, that seems to be associated with a worse outcome. So a good example being that if you have type 2 diabetes and you have some kind of acute brain injury, you probably are going to have higher blood sugar levels, and you may have a worse outcome than somebody who didn't have type 2 diabetes but is otherwise similar, has a similar injury. Same with a concussion. So even if there are cravings for glucose, ensuring stable blood sugar levels is an important aspect of concussion or brain injury recovery, which is where, nowadays, and the randomized clinical trials are being done currently, but nowadays I might talk about other alternative fuels that you could use in that setting that don't cause high blood sugar spikes, like lactate or ketones, which seem to support the metabolic requirements of the brain without, causing any issues with blood sugar.
So is that achieved by reducing sugar intake, a carbohydrate and or sugar intake completely?
I don't think it needs to. Obviously, You can institute ketosis by going on a low-carb ketogenic diet, so you can produce the ketones yourself. I think what's more important is just maintaining stable, normal blood sugar levels, 80 to 100 milligrams per deciliter fasting, and then after a meal, spikes no more than 120, 130. How you achieve that, I don't think we really know what's best. But again, if you were to measure your glucose and how you respond to foods, you can maybe tailor that appropriately. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to eliminate carbohydrates, but maybe focus on those that don't cause large swings. In the setting of an acute injury, it's true in brain injury, broken bones, and you have some kind of inflammatory response, different parts of the body become insulin resistant. So you are more likely to get elevated blood sugar or large swings in blood sugar. So again, it's just something that you need to keep an eye on. And I see you raise your eyebrows. One of the reasons for that is that you are diverting, so some of the peripheral tissues become insulin resistant in order to divert glucose to the immune system as part of the immune response. So you get higher blood sugar levels, so more blood sugar is available to those immune cells to do their job.
That is amazing. Okay, very cool. All right, so if we make this super applied, super behavioral for just a moment, what I'm hearing you say is, listen, on the nutritional side here, just keep it pretty steady, right? Like anytime you're going to have a swing, which could be a banana or cookie, but you need to measure it yourself. This is why those consistent glucose monitors, am I saying it right?
Continuous glucose monitors.
Continuous, yeah, thank you. Continuous glucose monitors are really something of interest so that you can learn about your individual responses to food choices.
One thing that I'm really, I guess, concerned about in the biohacking community, continuous glucose monitors are part of this, sleep monitors are part of this, is this kind of pathologization of things that should bring us joy, being sleep and food. So yes, wear a continuous glucose monitor, test it against things that you eat frequently. If there's something that you eat frequently that causes a big blood sugar spike, consider swapping it for something else. And I think that's as much as most people need to do. Because then you're armed with that knowledge, right? So maybe the thing that causes a big swing is ice cream. But every once in a while you're like, hey, I'm going to enjoy this ice cream. I'm not going to worry about the blood sugar spike, because worrying about that blood sugar spike is probably going to be more of an issue than the blood sugar spike itself. And there's even data suggesting that your expectation of a blood sugar spike causes a bigger blood sugar spike, regardless of the meal that you ate. So this is done by Ellen Langer, who's you've probably heard of, this amazing psychologist at Harvard. And she's done multiple studies looking at glucose control in diabetics.
Yeah,
and
I've had some good conversations with her. She's done some really interesting work around just expectations and settings. Yeah, it's really remarkable.
And so in this one study, is one of the more recent studies, they took diabetics and then they sort of did a crossover study. So they got both conditions, where a low sugar milkshake and a high sugar milkshake. And you got to read the nutrition label, understand how much blood sugar is coming in. That's important for diabetics, particularly if they have to give insulin, right? You need to know what's coming in. And so in the high sugar condition, obviously they got a bigger blood sugar spike than the low sugar condition. The thing was, this was the same milkshake both times. So thinking that more sugar is coming in is going to cause a bigger spike, which brings me back to people who have continuous blood sugar monitors all day, every day for everything they eat. You're going to get to a point where you're expecting a big spike because of the pizza you're about to eat, and then you're going to get a big spike because you're expecting one. So there's a lot that kind of comes into this. But yes, the things you regularly eat, understand how you respond to them, be armed with that knowledge, but don't then, as soon as you quantify something, there's interesting data on this. As soon as you quantify something, you start to lose the joy in it. You start to objectify it, and it's no longer a thing that can bring you joy in the same way. So have the necessary knowledge, but don't then, over complicate or over focus on it.
Very cool. And then super pragmatically here, like if somebody's going to have a cookie or an ice cream or something, would you recommend that they also balance some of that, save a little bit of room, if you will, for a handful of nuts or something that's got some, I don't know, maybe it's some sort of protein? Ice cream and eggs doesn't sound right to me, but ice cream and nuts sounds actually doable. Like, do you recommend that for stabilization?
Yeah, and as much as is practicable, there are a number of studies on meal order. So say if you have a meal that has 3 components, You have a protein component, a vegetable component, and a starch component. Eating your protein and vegetable first, followed by the starch, and that could be eating your eggs before you eat your ice cream, causes a smaller blood sugar spike. So yes, in general, I often, just because it's not something that people always focus on, and it's easy to not eat enough of, if you focus on protein either around or before something that might cause a large spike, and again, I don't want you to become super obsessed with it because I think that defeats the point. But in general, eating some of those things before something with a higher glucose or carbohydrate component or something that might cause a blood sugar spike can then blunt the later response.
I think you'll just find it fun is that maybe it's a glimpse into my family too. It's a best practice for us to eat protein before we're going to eat protein, vegetables, and then we'll eat the carbs. And like the challenge is when you go to a restaurant and they bring the bread out first, or they bring a glass of wine out, and you're like, I got to wait. Do I really have to wait? But maybe a little, I don't know, shrimp cocktail does the trick beforehand. But yeah, okay. So can we get back to a bit of the mind-brain connection here for a minute? And I'm curious your take on how expectations are actually creating a physiological response that doesn't quite make sense to just the property alone. So the expectations that I might get sick, the expectation that this is going to be fun, the expectation that this is going to raise blood sugar levels. So can you maybe just speak to that a little bit on how you're understanding that?
It probably depends. It may depend a little bit on the individual context. So if we talk about everything about the blood sugar, I actually discussed this study with Dave Rabin, who's a mutual friend of ours. So I think in that context, so say you're a diabetic, an insulin-dependent diabetic, the process of eating carbohydrates is in itself, it's an arduous one, right? It's something every day requires cognitive input. You need to decide how much insulin you need. There's this whole process that most of us don't have to go through. So in this setting, in that study, there is some degree of potential physiologic stress associated with knowing that there's this incoming carbohydrate, this glucose load that I need to deal with. So any kind of physiologic stress itself through the release of cortisol, catecholamines, adrenaline, increases blood sugar. So I think that one is potentially relatively easy to explain away. They didn't measure those things, so I can't tell you that's exactly what it is. But in my mind, I can see people who have continuous glucose monitors get stressed about the food they're about to eat and how it's going to affect their blood sugar level. Like you can physically see it as they, and often they document it on Instagram for some reason. So there's that aspect. Then there are more complex things, and again, I talk about this particularly because it's interesting to me from a genetic standpoint. When you tell people, so this, I'll wind back a little bit. There was a study where they took individuals and they put them on a treadmill. They did a 30-minute treadmill test. How far can you run in 30 minutes?
This is a great study.
You know this study?
Yeah. You know what? I've had almost 400 interviews, three something. Not one person has brought up this study yet.
Great. I'm so glad.
This is very fun. Yeah, I'm stoked for you to introduce it. This is a great study.
I think it was in Nature Human Behavior, if I remember. So they did a treadmill test, and then they did a genetic test, and then they told people you either have a good gene for endurance exercise or a bad gene for endurance exercise, and then they had them redo the test. Those who they told had a good gene did the same on average. Those who were told they had the bad gene did worse. Except for the fact that it wasn't true. They randomized people to be told whether they had the good gene or the bad gene, regardless of what gene they actually had. So this is when we talk about genetic risk, and when we talk about these tests that people are doing in terms of genetics, you have a risk for this. I worry that you're like almost manifesting that in your mind, regardless of whether the gene is having an effect. What's super interesting, in that same study, they looked at a different gene, the FTO gene, which is the single SNP that in a westernized population is most associated with being overweight or risk of obesity, even though the effect is teeny tiny on average. And then they gave people a test meal, and they looked, and then they measured their satiety, and they looked at their physiologic response in terms of hormones that respond to a meal and are associated with satiety. And they did the same thing. Said you either have the high risk gene or the low risk gene for FTO. And again, it was randomized. It wasn't actually true. And those people who were told they had the high risk gene, it changed how their physiology responds to a meal, right? You can measure it in the hormones, right? It's not something you could explain away with some kind of like magical thinking, oh, they told they had a bad gene, so they just gave up, right? You can measure it in the hormones, which is incredible. So there is this process whereby the mind can physically change physiologic responses in a way that can measure. And this is part of that expectation. So I don't have a great answer for you, but we are seeing these amazing things in the literature that I love to talk about.
It's complicated. I mean, and this is where you and I have spent our life efforts trying to understand interaction between mind, brain, environment, choice. It's remarkable that the way that we think can fundamentally change our neurochemistry, our neuroelectrical, our behavioral response we get. But it changes something at a structural level that is like, are you kidding me? So in the shorthand of this is placebo and nocebo. And, placebo, if you think something's going to work, we find that, or that there's a change will take place that, that alone can account for some of the change. Nocebo, which doesn't get enough credit, or talked about even in literature frequently enough, is that if you don't believe something is going to create change, sure enough, there's an output commensurate. So I think it's really fascinating that the way that we perceive and interpret and use our mind has a direct impact on our physiological condition. So, we're just getting started, I think, in this very specific lane about how to optimize thinking relative to one's health span. And so, the easy kind of horseshoe that we're going to toss out there is optimism. Yeah, it's good. There's good research, positive thinking, if you will. It's a little overrated. It makes me kind of gag a little bit just thinking, just be positive, you'll be good. But there is something that's taking place on expectations and the way that we use our mind.
I was going to ask you about, whether you read the work of Gabrielle Oettingen on positive thinking?
Yeah, it's good. It's really good.
I just find it interesting because you mentioned because when you mention positive thinking, I immediately think of her and how if you always imagine yourself achieving something through positive thinking, you can almost trick your brain into thinking you've achieved it without actually ever having to put in the effort to do it. So it's just an interesting other side of that.
Yeah, so
I always think about when people mention positive thinking.
One of the positions to consider when you're thinking about saying your goals out loud or doing mental imagery and or having a dream board or vision board or whatever is that there can be that confusion to your brain where it's not sure if it's actually already happened, so that there's a decrease in volitional effort. And I'm shorthanding a bunch of work here. I find it interesting, but I have also found that it's there's a better return when we are precise and clear about what it is that we're working toward. And so I've found that as a interesting conversation, I love the work that she's introducing. And from an applied standpoint, I'm far more interested in people actually doing the alone work to get incredibly clear about what a future state or condition that they're working toward is and could be and is beautiful and amazing and compelling. Get clear with that, and then don't live in a fantasy land. Like actually, be really grounded on a day-to-day basis about what you're working towards. So anyways, that's a good conversation. We should probably get Gabrielle on. I think she's done some really good work. Okay, awesome.
Sorry, I sidetracked you. What were you gonna mention next?
No. I want to get into. So I want to go back upstream. You talked about supply, you talked about demand, and you talked about metabolism. Is that correct? Those three?
Yeah.
Right. And you can either increase or decrease, and some sort of downhill effect will take place. And we're in the game of trying to increase those, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to thin slice quickly is that there's a difference between acute stress and chronic stress. And chronic stress is the one that we're most concerned about from a debilitation of resources. Acute stress is necessary and needed.
Yeah.
Right. And
Absolutely.
you're calling acute stress challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So,
Okay.
so you might, I would call it in this context. I'd call it a challenge. But I mean, you could also call it an acute stressor, a hormetic stressor. Any of those would apply.
Okay. And acute stress also is not to be confused with what you're talking, like an alarm bell that goes off, like a fire drill that goes off is an acute stress, but it activates the system in a very different way than a challenge. And I'm not going to parse those two things out right now, but I like the sensitivity between challenge, acute, and chronic. Okay. There's also in between acute and chronic, there's a phase of like midterm stress.
Subacute might be the something like that.
Subacute is what you're talking about. Right. Okay. All right. Okay. So let's get into some of the application here from a brain perspective. Is that I want to do a great job in my life, and I think others in this community want to do a great job of taking this vast science that you've been fascinated with and saying, okay, how do we make it simple for me to live a quote unquote healthy life for as long as I possibly can? And then there was a bunch of research around telomeres a number of years ago. And I saw some controversy maybe 2 or 3 years ago that maybe long telomeres, and maybe you can coach us up on this, is not the thing. It's not a bit of the holy grail that we once thought. So can you explain telomeres? Can you explain that? And then can you also get into some very applied things that we can do to increase the quality of a healthy life?
Telomeres were probably the first big way in which people thought we could measure the pace at which cells were aging. And telomeres are essentially the caps on the ends of chromosomes, which hold the majority of your DNA. And every time a cell replicates or is damaged, those telomeres shorten. And once they are gone, essentially, or very short, you can no longer replicate or split that cell, replicate that DNA. That's particularly important for stem cells, of which we have pools for different organs and functions throughout the body. And eventually, you will exhaust those pools of stem cells. They will become something called senescent. People may have heard of that, particularly in the longevity arena. It basically means they are no longer able to replicate. And often, once pools of cells become senescent, they also become kind of chronic inflammatory. They kind of sit there and they're grumbly and not very, very happy, and they can create this sort of systemic and local sort of inflammatory condition, which is associated with this process of aging. And so measuring telomeres became this big thing that was going to be part of telling you how old you are. The problem is that telomeres is mainly the way that we measure them, not necessarily that they're not useful, but each different tissue and each different cell type has different lengths of telomeres and different rates at which telomeres shorten. So if I wanted to measure your telomeres and assess your rate of aging, I'd probably have to do it multiple times over time, and I'd have to do it in multiple tissues. So I'd have to do like a liver biopsy and a muscle biopsy, and maybe I'd do a brain biopsy if I wanted to know how fast your brain was aging. We can't because we're not going to do that, right? Because other telomeres that we can easily measure, either from white blood cells in your blood, or from, usually we do a cheek swab, so just from epithelial tissue inside your mouth. Those aren't reflective of telomeres across your entire body. So that's kind of been the issue with telomeres, is actually they're not that reflective of the aging process of the body as a whole. Another part of it is if you look at the white blood cells of the white blood cell telomeres, the number and proportion of different white blood cells that you have circulating in your blood at any given time changes all the time. And different white blood cells, types of white blood cells have different lengths of telomeres, and that is a massive confounder as well. So there's just multiple reasons why telomeres aren't a useful thing to look at. There have also been studies where people have given telomerase. So for a while, people took telomerase, which is basically an enzyme that sort of adds back the telomeres. And they don't seem to be particularly beneficial either. And I think one of the most important things to think about in this longevity arena is what's sort of the output, what's the epiphenomenon, what's the thing that you measure versus what are the factors that are contributing to this process. So if you're exposed to a lot of things that cause your telomeres to shorten, just adding an enzyme that's just going to be continuously working to try and add on telomeres, it doesn't make any sense, right? You haven't removed the environmental factors that are stimulating the aging process.
So that doesn't slow down the process? And I know there was a whole boom in the nutrition supplement industry around this.
Yes. So I think TA65 is the telomerase product that I believe is still on the market. Some people take it, some in high doses. It's very expensive. There is no evidence that it works in humans. I think it works in animals, but there are a million things you can do to it to make a mouse live longer, almost none of which have translated well to humans. And there are multiple processes that we could maybe dig into, but basically, so another one might be cellular NAD. You may have heard of. There are lots of different supplements and processes you could do to replenish that because it does decline as you age.
NAD plus
so NAD plus being the main sort of electron carrier throughout the cell. It moves energy throughout the cell essentially, and it declines with age. And yes, you can replace it, and there are supplements that do seem to improve levels of it in humans as well as in animals. But I don't really want to focus on that. The more important thing in my mind is what are the processes that cause you to lose NAD in the first place?
I get you. Yep.
And so when you damage your DNA, and that could be through, again, toxic exposures. We talked about heavy metals. It could be chronic inflammation caused by, I don't know, a dental problem or some kind of infection. DNA or oxidative stress, DNA damage.
Or anxiety. I just want to add that to the mix.
Oh, yeah. Any kind of physiologic stress that is chronic can do that. Absolutely. Through stimulating those same pathways. And so when you damage your DNA, the process of repairing it uses up NAD. And also at the same time, chronic inflammation, chronic stress blocks the pathway through which NAD is regenerated. And finally, you regenerate NAD at least partially by activating enzymes that are on a circadian schedule that requires adequate sleep. So where a lot of people are focusing on the supplement that replaces NAD, I myself would be interested in, well, what's the process that's causing you to use it up, not produce it, not recycle it adequately? And that includes anything that, chronic psychological stress, inadequate sleep, inadequate nutrition, all those things. That's where I'd focus first, personally.
Okay. I love this. I feel like I could go on and on and on with you. And I wonder if you could just take us home on purpose and as it relates to the brain. And I'm thinking about kids. I'm thinking about folks our age. I'm thinking about, folks that have retired as well. But can you talk about purpose from either an applied and or a scientific standpoint?
When you look at the literature in that arena, and I know the psychologist in you, if I use purpose and meaning interchangeably, they are not the same thing. But
they're not.
In general, if we think about things like that, where you are committed to or feel you're committed to something outside of yourself, some process, ideally that contributes in a greater way to society, other individuals, that seems to be like one of the best predictors of long-term health. And even interestingly, healthy aging. So there was a study that's kind of related where they asked people about their thoughts on aging. And those who were, sort of scared to age, had this sort of negative thought process about the process of aging, actually ended up with worse health, mental and physical health outcomes than those who are like, aging is something we all do. I embrace it. It's part of who I am as, right? So just thinking about how you connect to all of these things, individuals and within yourself, has a big impact. And there are multiple different ways to think about this. But in general, I think it comes back to this feeling of connection or demand, which is that humans require interaction with the physical environment. And that's your movement, singing, music, language, and social connection. And so there are multiple ways that you can think about it. There are multiple ways that you can apply it. But our purpose, if we have one, it could, you can think about, so if you think about it from a reproductive standpoint, we're often told that you're just there to pass on your genes. And then after that, there's no evolutionary pressure on you as an individual, and you will rapidly die off. And you're essentially just a useless husk that's taking up space, and is just your genes that will continue in your children. But I don't feel that's necessarily the case, because as, in the reproductive standpoint, as you get older, you have a purpose, which is to support and look after your genetic line as it comes behind you. So there is some evolutionary drive to live a successful, longer life, so that you can assist backwards in that way. And that, for a lot of people, at least traditionally, was their purpose, as you become, the matriarch or the patriarch of the family, and you look after your children and their children. And that is kind of one very, easy to imagine example of this purpose that you're contributing to. And it has some kind of, evolutionary aspect as well. But it obviously doesn't need to be that. It doesn't need to be that. People may get that through church or CrossFit or volunteering. There are all these things that I think have the same benefit, because they are this same connection to society and something more than just looking after yourself. So that's how I think about. I think that's how I think about purpose. And when you look at the research on purpose, it seems to be protective of a whole host of things. And I think you can boil it down to that. You are telling your body, your brain, that it is useful, that it is required, that it is meaningful, and that has a distinct physiological effect that you could measure if you wanted to.
I love it. That last line is really powerful, because it relates back to what we're talking about for blood sugar levels, even sickness. Like if you expect something, or you have a standard that this is happening, that this is important, that it's sending a whole host of signals that we're not sure exactly how it's working. But what I love about this idea is that purpose is 100% under your control. And so it's one of the great predictors of quality of life. And this is something that you don't need to go outside of yourself to determine your own purpose in life. And the three components: it's bigger than you, it matters to you, and it's got some distance between when it can be experienced now and in the future. So it's future oriented. So very cool. And then I just would love a little summary of, if I knew what you knew, if we knew what you knew, what would be some of the best practices on a regular basis that maybe you just kind of consider like to be, I don't know, uninteresting? But what are some best practices that you employ? And it can be anything from supplementation to the way that you wake up, the way you go to sleep, the way you prepare for meals, whatever. Like, what are some best practices from just a good old quality of life standpoint?
I think it's funny, because my answer is not very sexy. And I think my answer is also going to be what everybody knows already. And my personal journey through all of this has gone from, optimization, measuring everything, supplementing everything, continuously trying to tweak every biochemical pathway, which I have done in countless athletes who are trying to get that competitive edge, in people with chronic disease who are trying to improve their health. And I've become increasingly interested in, well, how can we just distill that down into something that hopefully I wish everybody could apply? And I say that because the things that I do and the things that I would recommend require some aspect of privilege, time, money, resources, access, to some degree, because there are individuals who have to work 3 jobs, so they're never going to get the time to sleep, or maybe prepare the food, or be able to afford the food that I feel every human should have the right to eat. So that's always going to be an issue that I struggle with. But best practices are a regular sleep and wake time, as regular as possible, the same every day, as much as possible. And again, before I go into all of this, the most important thing I think of all of this is not to worry when this doesn't happen, because I worry about that. I worry about that worry more than the process of that happening, once or twice, or occasionally. So regular sleep and wake time. So that includes being exposed to bright light in the morning, darkness at night. Real whole food, whether that's paleo, keto, Mediterranean, whole food, plant-based. I think only you know what makes most sense for you, and then maybe you do some tracking along the way to figure out how you might optimize that. That would be ideal. Frequent movement, and I don't think you need to go to the gym and lift weights, although I do think everybody should, but I don't think you have to. And so resistance training, 30 minutes twice a week. I think that's like the baseline that anybody can do. Walk at least 20 to 40 minutes a day. Between those two things, that's probably the majority bang for your buck. Exercise, cognitive function, cardiovascular fitness. If you build in some balance, ideally, that's it. And then, all that social connection stuff that we talked about. And again, you can find it in any place. And through that, you're probably going to get a lot of that cognitive stimulus that we talked about, learning new skills, maybe teaching others. You can build that into it, and frequently people do. That's essentially it, I think.
Basically, you're saying build the base.
Yeah.
Build the base.
And I, right now, am not 100% convinced that there's anything else the majority of people need to do.
It's very cool. Super clean, super crisp. I love that you can go wide and deep, which is really fun for me. So I want to just say thank you for, I hope I didn't do a disservice to the brilliance of your understanding of the brain by staying horizontal too much. But,
absolutely not.
Yeah, Tommy, I love this. So maybe a last takeaway on any concerns you have about COVID in the brain, anything there that you're paying attention to?
Yeah, super tricky, to be honest. And there are so many potential things that could come out of this. Obviously, the virus itself and how it may affect the brain. I think that is a component that we will see aspects of. Certainly, athletes, high stress, both physical and emotional or psychological individuals are probably those who are at the greater risk for long COVID, which obviously has a cognitive component. That's certainly what I've seen. Like almost all the long COVID people that I know or have worked with are runners, like high volume runners. And I think, and it's interesting. Now, before I don't want to go on too much of another tangent, but some of the changes that you see in the immune system in individuals who have metabolic disease, which is another risk factor, you also see in overtraining in athletes. Even though sort of from a metabolic health standpoint, they're completely separate. So that's one component, but I'm also, I think right at the beginning, there was this really interesting resilience that the population showed. Everybody was worried that, the social isolation was really going to affect people's mental health, but there seemed to be this the blitzkrieg mentality, we're all in this together. And people were connecting with it, family members, even if it was over Zoom. Early on, there was this nice response that I think created some resilience, but we've lost that now. And now we're at a point where mental health is declining. It seems like infant development is being slowed. We're no longer able to apply social skills, social interaction. We're no longer able to communicate. I'm speaking very broadly, but be able to communicate with others, who have different opinions from ourselves, be it face to face or online. So I'm mainly worried at that aspect now, much less about the virus in the brain and more about how the response is affecting social development.
More interested in the social psychological as opposed to the biological. So the long COVID stuff, let me just make sure I'm playing this back, as you're seeing it with folks that have metabolic disease and or overtraining conditions like ultras and or maybe any athlete minded person who is in the overtraining syndrome. having more complications for long haul.
Yeah, no. So the metabolic syndrome seems to be a greater risk for acute, hospitalization and death with COVID.
Okay.
The long COVID seems to be more in high volume endurance athletes, at least from those that I've interacted with. Obviously, others have gotten long COVID too, but that's the group that I've interacted with. But from a physiologic or immunologic standpoint, some of the changes in blood cell marker and white cell function that you see are similar in those two groups. And that may be part of the, in high volume, in endurance athletes, you can actually create this sort of physiologic, metabolic stress, localized insulin resistance, that kind of stuff, which is similar to the other side, even though these people are ostensibly healthy. So in that kind of high volume endurance athlete group, I think you're seeing some of those changes that are then predisposing them to long COVID.
And is long COVID a thing? I don't know anyone that in my life that has it. And so I hear people talk about it, but I haven't worked with a client, and I don't have anyone in my circles that have it. I do hear people that have had COVID maybe more than once. They're saying, hey, I'm kind of got a fog, but that fog is maybe, it could be attributed to a lot of things. And then, so you're nodding like, yes, it is a thing, dude. Right?
Oh, no. I'm not,
Okay.
I'm nodding that to everything you're saying, just because I appreciate your, the world that you exist in, and that you just haven't interacted with people with long COVID.
Yeah, I don't see it.
Which I completely understand. I have met and worked with several people who I have no reason to believe that it isn't a thing, and everything lines up and makes sense with them and their symptomatology and their previous risk factors. And like I said, they often, the story is they're usually fairly lean, very high volume endurance exercises, probably chronically under eating a little bit, in that sort of high volume exercise setting, get COVID, certainly test positive, have the acute phase, and then just never recover from a fatigue and cognitive function standpoint. And obviously lots of parallels in other post-viral syndromes, which are very common and do exist and can go into, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. When we measure it, some of the tests that you've done, like Bob Navio has done similar studies in patients with chronic fatigue. You see this sort of downregulation of the mitochondria, hypometabolic type picture. So there's some kind of turning down of the metabolic system as a result that's long-term that you need to sort of build back from. So from my experience, I do believe long COVID is a thing, and post-viral syndromes, in general.
And how are you treating it? How are you helping folks sort it out?
So there's a number of approaches that people are taking. There's
sleep. Get your blood sugar pretty standard.
I'm trying to not give you the same answer, because that's yes. So in general, these are overstressed, overworked, overexercised individuals. So all of that nutrient dense calories, sleep, rest, and recovery, that obviously has a role. Some people are getting interesting results, particularly by focusing on NAD, like we mentioned earlier. So protocols that include niacin, quercetin, which prevents the breakdown of niacin. Some people have found some benefit in that arena. There was actually a South African group that sort of first focused on that. They published that as a hypothesis paper. Some people have found benefit from that. Part of it, it's the same in sort of chronic fatigue type settings, is essentially a graded return to activity. And what is very common is that on a good day, you want to do a whole bunch because you haven't done very much, and you overstress the system and you sort of set yourself back. So doing just a little bit. So again, it's that very graded, what's challenging on that day, you should continue to do that and make it the same and slowly build it up. And it's frustrating for a lot of people because you're like, I'm a runner. I want to get back to the running that I was doing previously. But actually, it's better to do the same amount on days when you feel good and when you feel bad, and slowly build back up. And there's a theory, and I won't say that I believe it's true or not, but it's an interesting theory, the central governor hypothesis, which Tim Noakes has talked about, which is basically the brain controls the physiologic output of the body as a protective mechanism. And in chronic fatigue,
so you don't overheat to borrow analogy from like an engine, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It kicks on to say, hey, slow down. And what the endurance folks understand is that you got to push right past that thing. Right?
Yeah. And so
ignore those signals.
And part of it is, and this is, you learn the same thing with like the traditional attritional approach in endurance exercise training. You one of the reasons why you do like these really lengthy sessions at threshold is to train your mind to know that you can do it.
And threshold is that really difficult, hard to function standpoint. Like it's not undoable. It's the place where it's like really just hard on the treadmill or on a run, but then you stay in that at tempo for an extended period of time.
It like never gets better, but it's painful. It never gets better, but you can keep doing it for 30, 40 minutes an hour.
If you can get your mind around staying in that boring, uncomfortable, I just love that apple pie right now. Right? Like it's just dealing with that thing, right? Yeah. Or just stopping
and so part of that training is that you're teaching your brain that you can do it. And I think
teaching your mind or your brain?
A bit of both. Yes.
I would agree.
And so I think there's some unconscious aspect, but there's obviously a conscious aspect as well. And so I think in the setting of chronic fatigue, post-viral syndromes, part of it, and it's not the case for everybody, so I don't want to generalize because each individual experiences it differently, but part of it is retraining your brain that it's okay to exert yourself in this way and taking the brakes off. But it's a slow process because it's a self-protective mechanisms that you need to sort of retrain over time.
Yeah, same with concussion. Like the protocol to come back is super gradual, so the brain doesn't go, whoa. We've been here before, and we're not going there again. It's a retraction that's taking place. Okay. It's a little bit like a balloon. You've got to blow it up slowly to get the real full expansion.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Dude, like I know we're way over time and I really appreciate it. I could go on and on. So maybe we'll just get a round 2 of all things fun and exciting, in the brain health, lifespan, healthspan standpoint. And then best place people can learn about and watch your thoughts and kind of be part of your world. Where do you want to drive them?
Probably the best place is Instagram. If people use that at Dr. Tommy Wood. If I do podcasts, I'll post them on there. Very, randomly, I'll have a thought about life and the world, and they will result in a post. Or maybe it'll just be my stories where I'm smoking brisket, or pictures of my dogs. But you'll get all of that if you go to Instagram.
Tommy, you're a legend. All right, brother. Take care. Appreciate you.
You too. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.